Almost sounds like it's kind of like a therapy session with the candidate, right? Tell me about your mother. Tell me about, but how people react and really shows the inner side of them, I would assume.
In fact, we've actually had instances where people will become visually emotional during these sessions.
Sure.
Now, that's not the intention behind it.
Hi, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the Nairobi Gold Rush podcast. And on the podcast, what we do is we interview the top executive leaders throughout the East African ecosystem. We are looking towards entrepreneurs, CEOs, and great executive talent. And we have a very special guest with us here today. So we have Ossian Plummer. I guess that's how you say that, right?
That's correct.
And Ossian is, I guess you would say an executive recruiter is the right word for this. Headhunter, some might say, but probably executive recruiter is the more appropriate word for that. And he's going to teach us today how to get to that executive level and what executive recruiters look for and how they're just looking for the talent to get that level. So welcome to the podcast.
Cool. Thank you very much, Scott, and thank you for having me. So I'm Ossian, senior partner with Triage and one of the two co-founders. It's great to be here.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about Triage, just at a high level, what does it mean to be an executive search firm, and what does that actually mean to somebody? Maybe?
Sure. Yeah. Maybe good to start with the name.
Sure.
So triage means to sort or sift according to priority, which is exactly why we chose the name for search, because that's what we're looking at. The background to the business, my personal background is I worked in contract recruitment for a period of time in London. That's where I'm from. And my co-founder, David, worked in private equity, venture capital, corporate turnarounds, and also a bit of industry, as well as the leadership team.
Nice.
Who have operated across Africa for many years now.
So he understood kind of that world of the venture capital, private equity, what all these big investors, what they're looking for, and the executives they bring on, and then you had the recruiting side, I guess?
Exactly, yeah. Much of his time was spent turning around businesses, rescuing failed businesses, but also as an operating partner where he'd work with founders and leadership that wasn't ultimately executing their strategy.
Oh, wow. That's pretty amazing. So maybe so we can get into this, like, where did you mentioned you come from London, or I guess from England, right? So London is kind of the area you're from?
Yes, correct. So I was born and raised in the southeast,
Sure.
In a place called Kent. Had a very fortunate upbringing, and didn't quite appreciate what I had, as is the case for a few of us. And really, my life changed. There was a transformational moment in my life at the age of around 15.
Sure.
Which, without going into too much detail, completely turned everything around for me and helped me realize exactly what I had, and that I shouldn't let that go to waste.
And it does seem very, I would say, uncommon from a guy from England to be down here recruiting, East African talent, right? So
Yep.
maybe, you could describe that a little bit more, like, how it's really interesting to think that you had this transformational experience that kind of changed your perception, particularly coming from more a well-off background, I guess.
Yeah. So once this event had occurred, a couple of years passed. I went into contract recruitment, and actually, when I was in London, I always felt this nagging lack of purpose, lack of connection to purpose, as did my co-founder David. And so we decided to start Triage. We basically spent the next 2.5 years talking to anyone who talked to us from around the world, investors, operators, entrepreneurs. And in that process, came to understand that actually there was a lot of hidden potential within the continent. And through further conversation, actually got invited down to South Africa by our first client in mid-2017.
Oh, wow. Okay. And that's pretty, and was that your first time to go down to South Africa? I mean, had you been traveling in the area before? Or?
Yeah, so my family's quite familiar with South Africa. My father, in particular, invested in a couple of businesses down there. Spent quite a lot of time down there. I'd personally visited. And when we got invited down to Johannesburg, we jumped at the opportunity. Said, this is a fantastic business, incredible value proposition, both from an employer perspective, but also opportunity perspective for the individual. Yeah. And then proceeded to take this mandate, which to date I've never had anything like it. There was a very, very specific requirement for someone with a specific set of values for Black economic empowerment in line with the South African recruitment strategy, as well as all of this complex criteria around getting a group CFO for a private equity-backed business. Yeah. And it was an incredible 6 weeks that we spent looking for that person.
Exact niche. I mean, that seems like a very specific set of requirements. I mean, not just, well, we need somebody with this financial skills or this set of leadership skills. It's, we need this exact mold of a candidate is what you're saying. Like sometimes you have that happen, or is that kind of a unique thing at that time?
Actually, for the most part, lots of the organizations that we work with are very value-driven, so values-driven, sure. That is. And therefore, it's not unique to this specific circumstance. Yeah. Sure. From Kenya to Nigeria to South Africa to Egypt, to all of the other markets that we work in, oftentimes there will be a very specific set of criteria that is completely unrelated to the do and deliver of a role.
Sure. And I think that seems like something that, I mean, it's kind of like an unspoken thing, I would assume, right? It's like a lot of companies, they say, well, we have just kind of open employment, basically we'll take any criteria. But at the end of the day, I do assume there's that kind of, I don't know what you would call it, but the values of the company, come out in different ways that you see that are kind of behind the scenes that, like the average person doesn't necessarily see that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Oftentimes there's overemphasis in the recruitment process on job descriptions, of course, sure. Which is all functional and oftentimes very much focused on competency and capability. But that, in many ways, is just a fraction of what we need to be looking for when we're looking for what we've termed investable talent.
Yeah. I remember when I was... I was young and I was applying for a job, and the company would, they would say like, we won't take anybody who smokes a cigarette, for instance. Right? That was like the job description. I didn't smoke, when I was younger, but I found that to be like a very interesting, specific requirement. It was like, this company said, okay, this is exactly what we want. But that's pretty fascinating. So in your firm, so you have this thing called investable recruitment, is what you say, which is, I think that's very different terminology than I usually would hear from, like if I'm hiring a software engineering manager, right? I mean, I want somebody who can maybe pass the coding challenges. They fit right with the personality of the company. Obviously, they have a good education. You can tell they have a good temperament. There's the checklist of things that we go through. Yep. But I don't ever think, I've necessarily thought of it as like an investable talent. Maybe you could talk to us about your model for that.
Sure, yeah. Bearing in mind that for the most part, we are working at a board level. We're doing executive search and what we would term difficult to fill or business critical hiring. So the value of getting the right person is tremendous, sure. But also equally the cost of getting the wrong person is very significant. Sure. And so what we've termed as investable talent or investable leadership is the framework that we utilize to help our clients to engage, assess, and subsequently hire, but also actually promote leaders and individuals who have the prerequisite experience as well as a couple of other criteria that we're looking for. So perhaps to unpack that a tiny bit more, we look at 5 different dimensions sure. when we're considering recruiting someone. The first one is function. Can this person do and deliver what we require of them today?
Would that be like if you're hiring a CTO, for instance, let's say that this person has the technical skills or the kind of check boxes, like I was mentioning before, like with a certain person that fits the technical profile maybe?
Yeah,
like that?
absolutely.
Or if it's finance, they have the treasury background or accounting background that you're particularly looking for the job description.
Exactly. Yeah. It could be something as specific as prior experience and mastery of AWS in the CTO example that you've referred to. And then we go into the second dimension, which is much more about competencies and capabilities. Does this person have the skills, basically, to navigate in this environment? The third dimension that we look at is context.
Sure.
Yeah, a CTO, to piggyback off your example, a CTO in the UK fundamentally has to navigate different context to one in Kenya.
Sure. Yeah.
Equally, a CTO in Kenya who is working with a later stage funded business will have to navigate different challenges than a CTO in a much earlier stage business.
Sure. Yeah.
And so context is very important when assessing whether someone is going to be able to navigate and do and deliver within your context, within your reality as an organization. And then the fourth bit that we're looking at, the fourth dimension, is really about connection and chemistry. So what we've found is that actually in order to be an effective leader, but also actually an effective employee, you have to be able to build trust, because trust is foundational to relationship. And if you cannot build the right relationships, you will not be successful within an organization, especially when we consider earlier stage organizations.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. We were talking to another guy on the podcast yesterday where he was saying that they had the CEO was the husband and the CTO was the wife, for instance.
Yep.
And the company, of course, blew up after, like just a few months. In the other company, people were throwing punches in the office, because there's this mix of, I guess, cultural fit or like trust within the organization.
Yes.
And so how do you evaluate these things? These things seem like very complicated. To me, this seems like very complicated to look at a candidate and be like, this guy, it has what we're looking for. And I know the company, I guess, does a lot of the interviewing, but from your side, how do you be like, this is a person I want to stick my neck out there and say, this is the guy that I want to present?
Sure. Yeah, I think perhaps to jump back a tiny bit, because actually there's a fifth dimension that I think is important to answering your question, and that is character. Your character is basically, who am I and what are my values? And then how do I live out those values in my life? Lots of people miss this as they miss things like connection and chemistry, because they're oftentimes referred to as very soft and potentially actually intangible. But that's not the case, because things like character and connection and chemistry, these are all things that we can see in people's behavior. And if we can see it in their behavior, we can measure it, we can assess for it, and subsequently we can quantify the impact of that. So I would say that probably the biggest focus for us is character, and in leadership that's even more important.
That makes a lot of sense. And so are these the types of things now, I guess, with social media, I guess people's lives are kind of out there in public, that's something that you could like assess character pretty easily, or...
Yeah, and actually it's as simple as things like how people structure their day. What do they prioritize? Who do they prioritize? So, we'll talk to people who have a very, very clear interest in showing up as a father or a mother, as a parent. And it's very clear immediately from the way that they refer to their spouse or the way that they refer to their kids, ultimately what's important to them, because what's important to someone is what's going to drive how they behave and what they do, their habits. And ultimately that's what we're measuring.
And so like in that example, like if somebody, they're very family oriented, I have this great wife, I've got these great kids, I want to spend as much time with them as I can. I would assume y'all would see that as a positive thing, like that, instead of somebody who's like, I'm a slave to work and I'm going to show up for these executive jobs. I would assume like you'd almost think the opposite way. Like I want to put myself forward to say like, I work, 120 hours a week and I don't take any breaks or time off, or Is that kind of how you're doing that evaluation, kind of seeing how they talk about certain
Yeah.
things?
So as a part of our process, the second stage of our assessment process, which is the second interview, looks at general leadership.
Sure.
And in this, we'll unpack all of these different things. So, for example, we won't restrict it to how do you spend your time. We'll also talk about things like who or what has influenced you in your life. So, lots of the time people talk about parents, for example,
Sure.
because actually, like it or not, we are a product of our childhood.
Right. Yeah.
And so the way that people behave today is oftentimes directly linked back to their upbringing.
Sure. Yeah.
I think equally important is what we refer to as gateway moments.
Right.
And this is like what I faced when I was 15.
Sure.
It was a transformational moment that completely changed the trajectory of my life.
Right.
And lots of people have had these moments in their lives.
Sure.
Something bad happens, they lose a loved one. These are gateway moments that are really important to surface because ultimately they were on one trajectory and now they're on a completely different one.
Yeah.
And it also shows a level of self-awareness.
It almost sounds like it's kind of like a therapy session with the candidate, right? Tell me about your mother. Tell me about, but how people react then really shows the inner side of them, I would assume.
Yeah, absolutely. It shows you what's important to them, what they care about. In fact, we've actually had instances where people will become visually emotional during these sessions.
Sure.
Now, that's not the intention behind them.
Right.
But actually, when we talk about our past and we talk about gateway moments, they're oftentimes very emotional events. So, it is.
Yeah, no, it's very... I think there are these defining moments, and a lot of times these things don't come up in interviews. They don't, the typical interview, tell me about when you had a conflict at work, or the typical kind of, the standard interview questions that come up. That sounds very interesting because it seems like you're really trying to get in to the inside of the person.
Yes.
Well, that's pretty fascinating. I don't think a lot of people would have realized that that's how it works, right? I mean, I think that's very interesting. And then I guess so. You would say that's like what kind of percentage of the equation do you think that plays into it? Is that like 50% of it, or a large part of it?
It is a large part of it, but it's not. And just to be clear, it's not about judgment.
Sure.
So when you're talking about what's defined someone and how they show up today, we're not judging them. There's no right or wrong answer per se.
Yeah.
But you can assess the depth of how someone thinks.
Right.
And I think perhaps further unpacking character, there are a couple of key things that we'll look for, especially in the East African and actually a Pan-African context, which we believe to be absolutely essential to operating as leaders, as individuals in this environment.
Yeah, now that makes a lot of sense. I mean, like if I think about myself, I used to work in the U.S. in tech for about 10 years before I moved to East Africa, and then I've lived here for 12 years. Before coming to East Africa, I worked for a lot of government contracting and NASA and different places that, big government basically type of projects.
Yes.
Everything there's very structured. It's, I found myself to be like this type of, project manager that was, just, checklists and processes and very non-agile, I would say, right? Very, very structured. And then coming to East Africa and working in the East Africa startup community, over the last 12 years, my, completely shifted, right? So it's like being here, things are more kind of relaxed with the culture, very agile because there's a lot of competition here. I mean, of course, in the U.S. as well, there's a lot of competition in the startup world, but there's a lot of contextual things that have to change and evolve to be able to work in this context. I would say
Absolutely,
because the country just moves quite differently. My background from the U.S. or you from England. I mean, it's like there's a lot. It's hard to. I guess the one question I'd have is, how do you balance out like local recruiting versus international recruiting when you're looking for a candidate? Let's say if somebody comes here and okay, we're looking for we've got a company here that does X. We need a CEO, and you're trying to fill that role. How do you kind of balance it out, local recruiting versus international recruiting?
Sure. Yeah, no, it's a really valid question. The majority of our recruitment is local. Oftentimes, actually, because that's what the client has asked for.
Sure.
And it's something that we would absolutely push for as well,
Yeah.
if the experience, the skills, and the context exists.
Sure.
There are some very specific cases where actually by necessity we do have to do international search.
Sure.
And we have case studies of bringing people across from the UK, from the UAE, from the US, because actually the local talent pool was not aligned with what the client had asked us for.
Sure.
So all of our searches start locally. We'll then build out regionally, across the continent.
Sure.
And then as a last resort, we will look internationally, unless very specifically asked.
Yeah, well, that makes the most sense, because I think the local context, that is so important to a lot of the positions here.
Absolutely.
It's quite critical, and it takes a long time to understand all the nuances of how it works. Even myself living here 12 years, there's a lot that I haven't quite unpacked yet, or a lot of mistakes I make, just in the general context.
Absolutely.
And with your company, so are you typically recruiting for like venture capital firms, private equity firms, a mixture of both? Like, what's your typical client look like when you're coming to you for the search process?
Yeah, so we work both at a fund level, so with investors who are hiring investors, but also within the portfolio companies as well. The majority of our work to date has been with portfolio companies, and that's across private equity, but also venture capital. So we work from seed all the way through. Some of our later stage clients are at Series E.
Yeah. Maybe for our viewers, maybe you could kind of explain, is there a difference between what the venture capital firm is looking for versus the private equity firm in general? Are they looking for different skill sets, or?
It's interesting, and it refers a lot to context. Because actually, someone who could be a very effective CEO in a venture capital-backed organization could actually be disastrous in a private equity-backed organization.
Like what is there some specific things that you guys look for in that scenario? Let's say a private equity firm comes to you, and then you've got a candidate who's CEO of a, I don't know, let's say like my company, Safeboda, we're Series B, startup, and you've got a candidate, and what type of things would you be like, this is a red flag, maybe that this wouldn't be a good fit for private equity?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think I'll probably refer to my co-founder, David, and give a quick example about his background. So he worked in transformation, corporate turnarounds, and then the complete opposite, which was early stage businesses. Yeah. So you can be very effective in multiple contexts, but actually you'll never find him in a business as usual context. If you put someone like him, just because of who he is, his character, the way he is, what he enjoys doing as well as his skills and previous experiences, if you put that in a business as usual context, not to say it would be disastrous, but actually it's not the best use of him. Sure. What's really important for leaders to be aware of, and this is where self-awareness is so important, is actually, what is the best use of me? Where do I show up as my best self? Sure. And sometimes, you may be really attracted to that organization, but their current stage, their context, their reality, and the challenges that they face, they're not appropriate for you.
Sure. Yeah. No, I can imagine, a private equity backed, maybe a oil and gas company is a very different skill set than a startup, let's say video game development company, maybe, those are probably two different mindsets that you have to go into in skill sets as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's pretty fascinating to think about. And because I'm sure a lot of our listeners, they really want to, maybe they're a project manager somewhere in a company, or they're a software developer, or, whatever position they might have. And I think a lot of people have this ambition, they want to be the CEO, they want to be the C-level. What type of things should people be doing to start preparing themselves for that level? Like what can they be proactive about to
Sure.
get to talk to you, you know, in that sense?
Yeah, I think this comes down to a couple of things. So there's the question of chemistry and connection and relationships. It will always operate in a relational context.
Sure.
Yeah, when we think about East Africa, everything is done based on relationship, and I think it's going to remain, irrespective of the technologies, it's going to remain a really important factor when executives and also recruiters are reaching out to you, that you're able to effectively build trust and relationships.
Would that be things like maybe getting out and going to the Africa Tech Summit and, you know, getting in front of a lot of different companies and people and making these relationships?
Yeah,
Is that part of it, or?
Absolutely. And I think also creating value. You know, there's lots of people looking for an amazing job, but actually what value are you creating proactively in relationship? How are you being proactive in relationship is equally important. And then I think the other considerations when looking for this kind of role will actually come down to unpacking character. So in East Africa and across the continent, in all of our recruitments, there are 4 really key things that we look for in leaders when we're recruiting.
Yeah.
The first one is teachability.
Okay.
You know, does this person have a growth mindset, and can they learn? You know, they open to learning, like you referred to in your experience of coming across from the States and being in a completely different context. If you're not teachable and you apply exactly what you had over there in this context, then you will not succeed.
It would be pretty disastrous. I remember when I first came over, I would try to take the U.S. approach to the problems here, and it was just disastrous. It was like, because you kind of come with a mindset when you're coming from the U.S. of, yeah, we have these great businesses. We've built Google and, you know, Facebook and all these big companies, and we have this model, and then you try it out here, and it's like, that doesn't really work so well. Yeah. And so you have to be flexible for sure.
Exactly. And then I think that ties into the 2 others, which are humility and self-awareness. Yeah. You can be self-aware. You can understand both internally, you know, who am I? You know, what do I do best? What's the best context for me? But also externally, how do I show up to other people? What's the impact I have on other people? You can understand that, which is the self-awareness part. But actually, if you don't have the humility to change that, and then subsequently the teachability to go on a journey of learning, then you will really struggle.
Sure. And what's interesting is, and I know this isn't exactly true, but you tend to have this picture of the high power executive, I guess. Right? You know, you got the guy in the fancy suit, you know, very extroverted, very very powerful, making decisions. You know, we're going to cut staff, we're going to turn things around, right? There's this kind of profile which seems a little bit kind of opposite from like what you're describing, right? Which is interesting to think that what you guys are actually looking for is maybe different than what the media or the stereotype is.
Yes. Yeah. No, it is. It can sound like that, and it can actually also come across as quite soft. But some of the most self-aware people, and those with higher levels of humility, are also some of the most successful leaders, not only in the region but in the world. And so the image can go hand in hand with that. And then perhaps just to round it off with the 4th, when it comes to leadership character, is what we refer to as faithfulness. Now, faithfulness is in many ways distilled to consistency and constancy. Am I consistent in my behavior? And then the constancy is all around, irrespective of everything else that's going on around me, do I have the same response? And they are 2 different things, albeit oftentimes confused.
Yeah, but maybe you could dive in a little bit deeper there on that. That's kind of an interesting one.
Yeah, so let's take an example, a very simple example. If you are faced with a stimulus, you will typically respond in a certain manner. Now, throw in the fact that actually, let's say, the energy in the room is different, and someone else comes in from the side and interrupts that stimulus and provides an external stimulus.
Yeah.
Actually, the constancy is that irrespective of the fact that there's another energy or something else in the room, you are consistent in your approach.
Huh. That's pretty interesting. So, and that's one of the 4 pillars, I guess, that you guys really focus on.
Correct.
So, wow. I mean, that's quite a complete package, I guess. So you have like these 4 pillars, and they all kind of have to fit together just perfectly to get that right candidate.
Exactly.
And plus the other things, the specific things the recruiters told you we have to meet a certain profile.
Indeed, yeah. It's
and so how does that work? Let's say you're okay. A company comes to you and says, okay, we need all these things, and you have your checklist of things that you're looking for.
Yeah.
And now you've got to find the person. How do you then go about finding them?
Yeah. So we've got a pretty exhaustive process. Our typical process takes about 6 weeks from commencement. Apart from the contracting and the nitty-gritty up front, what we will typically do is we'll start with a briefing meeting, which is sometimes referred to as an intake session. This is really about surfacing all of these 5 components of investable talent, and then perhaps digging into a bit more detail around things like the employer value proposition and subsequently the leadership value proposition.
Right.
We will then come up with our measurement for how we're going to assess anyone who comes through our process subsequently, which will both be shared internally, but also externally with the client, to ensure that they're bought into exactly how we're going to be mapping, assessing and measuring anyone who comes our way.
Yeah.
What we'll then do is we'll take a landscape approach to market. We don't rely on any database or any prior search activity. One of the things we find really important is making no assumptions or no prior bias to, I know this person.
Sure.
Let me just, give them a call.
Yeah.
Everything has to start from a blank sheet of paper, and then we'll go out to market to map all of the organizations, whether that's locally, regionally, continentally, or even globally, their parallel markets, the investors, and any other peer who we deem relevant. And within those organizations, we will look at who are all of the people in their organogram that we need to be speaking to about this employer, their value proposition, and why they should entertain a move to this client. Yeah. We'll also run through things like the criteria that we're coming to market with, and how we're going to be assessing their suitability for that client. And that's when we'll go into further dialogue around the assessment process, which for us comprises 2 interviews, a leadership assessment, which is a self-assessment. We actually use a partner for that, which takes about 45 minutes to 1 hour to complete. And anyone who goes through that will actually be given a free coaching feedback session at the end of the search, irrespective of whether they got the role or not. Wow. And then we do formal referencing as well.
Yeah. Well, that seems like a lot of work to go through for candidates. We worked, like I mentioned, from the CTO role, hire a lot of technical staff. Definitely not looking for those, CEO, private equity guys. Yep. But what I've seen a lot of the standard recruiters do is they throw a lot of CVs your way. They've got some guys, and you're looking for Python. Okay, here's this guy knows Python. And then you start reading the CV. You're like, this guy's not a fit at all. Like, yes. So it seems like that when you're brought in, like it's for seriousness, and we're really going to go through this whole exhaustive process, and it takes a long time. It's very extensive, which is really, I think, probably pretty comforting to these big investors that you're working with.
Yes, and oftentimes actually people will try that approach first. Yeah. Perhaps they, from a costing perspective, they deem it more efficient, sure. Which is absolutely understandable. It is different. Mm-hmm. and they will try that approach. They may try with multiple recruitment firms.
Yeah.
And then they'll come to us once we're a last resort. And that's
Sure.
absolutely fine.
Yeah.
We've built our brand around rescuing failed searches.
Sure.
And even the example I referred to at the beginning
Yeah.
had gone through the hands of several tier 1 executive search firms before we rescued it.
Well, what's one, like, do you have an example of a search that you landed, like you got the candidate the job and then it ended up being really successful? Like you were really, really happy about it? I mean, you don't have to give the exact details if you don't want to, but.
Sure. Let me have a quick think. I think probably I would refer to a head of corporate finance role that we did for an East African business that was at the Series B stage.
Yeah.
They needed to raise about $50 million. Not a small
so
feat.
easy, yeah.
Really, what was really interesting about this search, from my perspective, was that the CEO was going to be working directly with this person, and the CEO was a founder. In fact, an incredible founder. She was, or she is, very good at public engagement. She's incredible with investors,
Sure.
and she's got a great story to tell, and she tells it really well. The challenge she was facing was, how do you take that and get that into practical action when it comes to fundraising?
Sure.
Yeah, how do you manage your cap table?
Yeah.
How do you manage investor engagements? How do you speak more technically into the finances of the organization? And then how do you structure your fundraise to ensure you're getting a balance between debt and equity, without impacting other investors as much as possible? And so this was something that was quite high profile. The investors were really interested in knowing about this. And that guy came in. He joined the organization after following this process. And in fact, he actually ended up raising about $62 million for the organization.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I think that would definitely be considered a very successful. I'm sure the investors were quite happy.
They were.
With that.
They definitely were.
You can have somebody who can speak that language. I mean, I think, because there's so many different skill sets needed. And I guess in basically every stage of the organization, I'm sure as it gets to your higher levels of fundraising, you need even more and more specialized expertise and more, I'm sure it's, different, raising a post-Series C round than raising a Series A round, and different skills are needed even to do that.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely.
Wow. Have you, when you're, interviewing candidates, have you ever had any crazy answers to interview questions that really shocked you, where it's like, oh gosh, this is like a bad, like you see, like I've seen these parody videos where, there's like a guy drinking a beer while he's talking on the interview, or maybe not that crazy, but.
Let me have a think about how to position this one. I've got a very specific example, and it was quite shocking.
Yeah.
But it was during, actually it was after the interviews, and it was during referencing.
Yeah.
When we did a bit of background checking, and informal referencing in this case. And the reference had provided this incredible story around the impact this person had had, how they'd shown up. But with the caveat at the very end of the call that all of this is said in the context that this person's sober. Oh. So when they're not,
to the end.
when they're not, then
things.
that is exactly not the person who's going to show up.
Yeah.
And so obviously you unpack that, and if you do have an alcohol problem, not to go into too many specifics, but if you do have an alcohol problem and it impacts your performance and your ability to deliver what's been put in front of you, then it is a problem.
It's probably not the thing that you guys were looking to hear.
No,
it's not,
it was quite the surprise.
Yeah. Yeah. Have you ever had cases of people, kind of lie about their CV? Like you check the references or something, it's like, wow, this is a completely different perspective than what we thought it was going to be.
Yes. Oftentimes, we're not just checking that this person's a good person by the time they've got to that stage. Yeah. Lots of it is fact checking.
Sure.
Lots of it is referencing behaviors.
Yeah.
And yeah, in several instances, you do surface some of these things very early on that actually perhaps they inflated a title. Maybe instead of head of sales, they were regional sales manager for a part of the country.
Yeah.
And so all of these things are important both to reference formally and informally. And also there's lots of data on the internet. You know, I've had instances where someone has said they've worked for X employer, but actually you look up their name on a simple Google search,
Yeah.
and you see their name appear under the organogram of a completely different organization that's not on their CV.
Related. Yeah.
And so, you know, all of these issues are things that we do come up against quite frequently. Obviously, would encourage people listening not to do that.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, I've seen personally like crazy stories. I remember there was a guy I went to I did my MBA many years ago, and I went to school with a guy, and you know, I was kind of wondering about this guy, and he was talking about his interview, how he got into the MBA program, and so what he did is he didn't quite have the grades maybe to make it in the program, and he got like 5 friends together, and what would happen is when the recruiter would call, you know, for the interview, you'd have to do like a phone interview for the program. He would have like 5 people, and they would answer the phone, you know, Mr. So-and-so's desk. Oh, I'm his personal secretary. Oh, he's so busy, he's talking to the prime minister. You know, he's really busy. He will be with you in 5 minutes, and then they pass it up to the next person pretending to be a secretary. Oh, this is his very personal assistant, and you know, go through this charade of like 5 people, and then finally we got him on the call, the most important man in the room, where this guy was just a regular guy, you know, sitting in his apartment, you know, eating Cheetos or whatever. You know, it's like
you do hear some stories.
Yeah, so I mean, you hear these things, and it's like the links that people go to land these big jobs. You know, it's like it seems like it's probably pretty crazy. Hopefully, you don't experience a lot of that, but I mean, I'm sure there are some strange things that you run into in these searches.
Yeah, and you do hear instances, and it happens once in a blue moon, that people will have other people interviewing on their behalf. Yeah. So you think you're speaking to someone who's just got issues with load shedding or something else.
Yeah.
But actually you're not speaking to that person. You're speaking to their friend who happens to be technically very competent. Yeah. And I mean, there are ways of getting around this, and like I say, it's rare.
Yeah. I think it happens maybe more so. I actually had a guy who was working for me personally. He was in a different country.
Okay.
This was pretty recent, about 2 or 3 years ago. And there were some strange things going on with the employee. I won't really go into the details, but I just was noticing something was weird, and would see like there was the guy's name. I never met him in person because he was very far in a different country, and we would, you know, check in on the phone, and we would had a lot of phone work and things like that, but never met the guy in person. And I started seeing, you know, his name on LinkedIn. He would be at different conferences in other countries, and I was just like, he's supposed to be working full time, so that we have a problem now. We need to discuss, like, hey, you're supposed to be working. I just saw you're in Spain somewhere, or you're somewhere you're not supposed to be, and this is a problem now. And after finally investigating further, he finally admits, well, I'm actually not this guy. I'm impersonating. I have the technical skills, but we used my boss's name and CV for the whole process, and so I'm actually not who, you know. Yes, I'm this person who knows how to do the programming and everything, but I'm not who I said I was. So of course we had to, you know, go through the whole termination process and everything. But
yes,
I'm just never surprised these days what happens.
Yeah, and actually lots of our clients have taken it a step further, beyond our process and their assessment process, and we have some clients who will go to the FBI, to the CIA through their reference checking, to ensure that there's no previous criminal activity or history.
Sure.
And obviously that requires someone to go in person with their passports, all of their documents, and to validate their entire history in many ways.
Yeah.
And it does take a bit longer, especially because we work with lots of organizations who are regulated by, for example, the Central Bank of Kenya. So lots of the time for senior roles, they do have to get clearance from the central bank.
Yeah.
And so this enhanced background checking is important. And ultimately that will surface a lot of different things if they are there. But most people won't sign up to being proven that they do have a criminal history when they said they didn't.
Yeah. I mean, hopefully by the time you're getting to that level that a lot of those type of issues are kind of getting out. Well, have you ever had a case, I mean, I guess keeping the sensitivity of your clients,
Yes.
where, maybe you've actually made a hire and then it's been a disaster and you've had to, like go begging back to the company, like, sorry, we'll make this right or something.
We have had, because our client base is very early stage in some cases, seed, pre-seed, pre-revenue in other cases as well. We have had instances of restructuring that has meant that actually the role that was is no longer.
Yeah.
In which case it is a tricky one.
Yeah.
Because yes, we do have within our contract very specific clauses as they relate to performance.
Sure.
And an individual's performance. If there is underperformance and for one reason or another, perhaps they don't pass probation, then we will do the right thing, which in our eyes is replace that person.
Sure.
But most of the time it is the nuances of dealing with very early stage businesses where things change.
Yeah. We thought we needed a marketing officer, but now we've restructured it. We don't really want that position anymore. We're putting it in a different job function or something.
Yeah.
I mean, I know in our company, we've done our share of restructuring and moving things around and adapting to the environment, just the way the startups typically have to do, and that's part of it. But I mean, I'm sure that's a stressful thing when you really put a lot into the candidate, and particularly that candidate, probably has left you've got to maybe recruited them from a good job, and now they've put everything in there, and now they're not needed anymore or something. That would be. It
is hard.
Stressful.
Yeah. That is a very difficult situation to deal with, and of course, emotionally, you feel a lot of responsibility because actually people's job moves are in your hands, at least for the most part. But it is also part and parcel of working with this kind of organisation. And so many times people understand the risks associated with working in seed stage businesses. It does come with the role. So I think most people don't get too upset about it. Of course, it is disheartening and it can be very upsetting. You do have to sometimes coach people through leadership crisis in the sense that, was it me? It's like a breakup, right? What did I do? And sometimes that can be a prolonged process, but we do our best to work with people on that basis. We've got some fantastic coaches who, like you referred to earlier, sometimes they can seem like therapists actually, because they do work through lots of these issues, especially around identity.
Yeah, I can imagine that's really difficult. How do you, I guess people are in different stages of their life when you're recruiting them. And let's say you have a seed company or early stage company, and maybe the offer that they have for candidates is not so great. Maybe it's a lot of equity, we're bootstrapping, little salary. How do you go about let's take myself, for instance, right? I've got a couple kids going to university. You got, I've got 3 kids, value financial stability, how do you recruit those type of people, and convince them to go to to those early stage jobs?
Yeah, we do get a lot of that, and obviously through our process, the priority is relationship, and so we do come to understand a lot about someone's personal circumstance, what's driving them, what's pushing them, and through that assessment, actually we do try in some cases to discourage people from moving forward in the process, because we recognize that the risk is too great, and so we ask questions that actually will enable them to process and realize actually this isn't for me.
Yeah.
And lots of the time we actually give people even more time to process things.
Right.
So we'll say, I reckon you should think about this over the weekend.
Yeah.
I think you should speak to your wife. I think you should speak with your extended family. You should also probably speak with some of the people in the organisation if it's not a confidential search. Because actually sometimes it's important to get that out the way up front rather than get to the end of a process and then go, actually, this is too risky for me.
Yeah.
But we do get a lot, and we do get instances where overnight someone's funding circumstance could be entirely different. Some people mid-process, their spouse loses their job.
Yeah.
And so suddenly what wasn't perceived as a risk is now risky.
Yeah, exactly.
And they're the sole income earner. And then other instances where someone who was expecting to get funding, funding was pulled last minute.
Yeah.
And so, that chief hire or whatever it was is no longer, and we now need to hire someone who is half of the original budget.
Yeah.
And we're a couple of
Candidate
weeks into the
profile.
process.
Yeah. Well, that's pretty stressful too. Wow, that's pretty amazing. Well, I assume in the recruiting industry, I'm assuming there's a lot of scam artists and people pretending to get candidates jobs. And I mean, so obviously with your organization, you're well vetted, professional company. What do our, listeners need to know about how to watch out for real recruiters versus the scam artists? What kind of things are telltale signs, or hey, this isn't a good deal for me to pursue?
Yeah, I think there are two sides to this. So the first side is whether they're a scam or not. Yeah. And I think this is quite difficult to know, especially in more saturated markets where lots of the work is contingent, multi-agency, where there are volumes of recruiters working on roles. Sure. And the same role for the same organization. And oftentimes it's very transactional. Yeah. So it's who gets the candidate first. Mm-hmm. And in that kind of case, it can be really difficult to know, how am I being represented as a candidate? So I think if I were a candidate, I'd be asking, do you have exclusivity on the mandate?
Sure.
Because you want to know that actually they are trusted by the client to be working this as the sole provider of recruitment services on this role. So I think that's probably the easiest way of telling. And I think also, through initial conversation and how much someone knows about an organization, you can also tell, does this person actually understand who they're representing? Right. Asking some very basic business strategy questions is oftentimes enough to understand, has this person just gone online, seen that there's a job open, is going to pull my CV and then chuck it to the client.
Trying to be a middleman or something
to
get a commission off of it just by doing that thing, essentially.
Exactly. And, have they actually been asked by the client? Do they have a relationship with the client? Is important. And then I think the other thing that's really important to distinguish is that there is a difference between a recruitment firm and a search firm.
Sure.
Search firms like Triage are working oftentimes on a retained and exclusive basis. Yeah. So we will have exclusivity over a mandate. Right. And the client has actively engaged us to go through that assessment process. Yeah. So they've committed to process. Right. Recruitment firms, oftentimes they work on a success or a contingent, which actually by definition means by chance.
So it's like if a recruitment agency sends me a successful candidate and I hire them, then we pay a percentage or a fee, a finder fee or something like that.
Correct.
But your company works in kind of a different manner. It's more of a retainer type of manner.
Exactly. So we only work on a retained and exclusive basis. Yeah. Personally, we would never compete with another third party. Sure. And most times we don't compete with internal resource either. Yeah. Recruitment firms, they're normally working on a larger volume of hires, and they'll be posting on LinkedIn. Yeah. They'll be telling the world. They don't normally go out to passive candidates who aren't looking for roles. Sure. Normally, they'll rely on candidates who are actively looking, who are building relationships, who are applying on LinkedIn. And it, in some ways, And this isn't to discredit at all contingent recruitment, because for some roles it works really well.
If it's the market for
yeah, it's great for what it works for, but sometimes it becomes a bit too reliant on candidates coming to them as opposed to going actively after people who aren't actually looking for change.
Yeah, well, I imagine like with your firm, if you have a company, let's say it's an oil and gas company, and they're like, okay, we're looking for a finance executive who understands oil and gas finance and this stage of company, et cetera. And then you go out and you're actually actively looking, okay, which companies fit this profile, which, all these different things you've talked about, the character and everything, kind of searching through and finding people that are aligned with that, and then contacting them directly to be like, hey, I've got an opportunity because, you might be a fit for this, versus hey, just everybody's pouring the CVs and, we'll go from there.
Yes.
I guess it's kind of
you in the process, you end up actually saving a lot of time, because what you've agreed up front and then subsequently what you've assessed and measured for are a fit.
Sure.
Sometimes these agencies will turn things around very quickly, but actually you have to go through multiple iterations to get to where you should have been if you'd just agreed in a more concrete form up front.
Right. Well, and I know when I search for candidates, we do a lot of hiring, and I have to look through 400 or 500 applicants for every role that we get, right? And it's just so tiring, and
it is.
And it actually becomes a little bit not very efficient, because you just have to kind of start scanning CVs and just throwing things aside, because you just can't look at each one in detail. And I think sometimes you lose a lot of good candidates as well, because it's just the volume is just so high, and everybody's sending their CV. Everybody wants the top jobs, and I remember myself, like even talking back to the idea of the scammers. I remember one time I was a young guy. I was living in Dallas, Texas, in the U.S. And I was young. I didn't have any skills per se. I was in tech, but that wasn't an executive. But I of course I thought at that age, I could be the boss, I could be the executive, running things. And so this recruiter had contacted me and said, hey, I think I could get you to be the CTO of company. I was probably 24 years old, big red flag there. And so I go down to this fancy high-rise office building, go up to this guy's office, immaculate, guy in the fanciest suit. And
what a dream.
Sitting down there, and he just starts telling me, oh, yes, we're going to get you to be a CTO. I've got all these companies lined up, it's a deal for you. And we talked for about an hour. Then he says, well, what I want you to do, I want you to go get your wife, go grab your wife and come back, tomorrow, because I have to discuss this, between you and your wife, make sure, everybody's on board and everything, because it's a big life-changing decision for you. Okay. So I get my wife, we go down there together. The guy starts, telling my wife, well, this guy's the best candidate. He's so good. Just really just putting the sugar on you.
Yeah.
Everything, super personable guy, just make you feel so comfortable.
Yeah.
Gets to it. And, okay. Yeah. I definitely am going to get you a CTO job. I've got it right here. All I need is $4,000 to, get you signed up on our program. And
of course. It's as simple as that, right?
Yeah, that's all. And then you start asking, well, you actually have these companies? Well, no, it's just a database, and you look at the companies yourself, and so luckily I realized, like, oh no, this is not legitimate, or nothing that I would want to sign up for sure. Yes. But
as if you had a choice in which company you'd become a CTO for, right?
Yeah, exactly. They just, but they made it sound like that they were just they had the direct telephone line to these companies, and they just call up and say, oh, I got this guy, he's the CTO, and we're going to join, and that's not how it worked, of course. So, but yeah, there's a lot of crazy stuff like that. But it's good to see that there's reputable, good companies, good strategies, and you seems like you probably had some success in this market. Have you found it challenging? So you still come from England, right? It's still a cultural difference, but it seems like you've been spending a lot of time here in East Africa and kind of world traveled almost, right? But
yes. Yeah, I think in reality, as much as we perhaps want to be local, as much as we perhaps think that we can understand, we will never understand what it's like to be Kenyan, East African,
Yeah.
African.
Right.
Yeah, we will never understand that. And I mean, the same applies for a Kenyan working in Uganda.
Sure.
Perhaps there'll be more similarities and they'll be able to adapt better, but actually they will never understand what it takes to be Ugandan unless they are actually Ugandan.
Yeah.
And so I think we try to recognise that as much as possible. That, you know, as much as we try, and we do try very hard to understand, that actually in order to be successful and to create the impact that we want, we actually, you know, we need to rely very heavily on our local team, who form the majority of our staff. So we've got some incredible people like Henry Njite, who's Kenyan, who's one of the senior partners and is responsible for delivery.
Yeah.
We've got Rafaro Mwanze, who leads she's senior partner responsible for leadership development, and having great people who have operated in this context, who in many ways can reel us in, and especially call us on things if they don't deem them appropriate, is really important.
Sure.
We don't want to be a Western firm operating into the continent. As much as possible, we want to be in the continent and run by leaders from the local markets.
Yeah. I remember it's very fascinating, this idea of like, okay, maybe an executive from Kenya, you know, may not be able to relate to somebody in Uganda. That was really surprising to me based on how geographically like small the area is.
Yep.
And even not only Kenya to Uganda, it's like there's certain tribes. I remember trying to fill a position one time, and all the people that would be working with this position were a certain tribe.
Yep.
And, you know, the first candidate for this position was a different tribe. This was just within Kenya, right? And it was like one of the tribes that, you know, they get along, right? But there's some tension sometimes.
Yes.
So it was apparent that this wasn't going to work, even though the candidate was a good fit for this position. It just wasn't going to work because the entire people that would be under there would, you know, they would just revolt, I guess, or something, you know.
Yeah.
Which is very kind of like you mentioned, like we have this very specific kind of hiring profile. Been great having you here. We look forward to talking to you again and having great success with the work you're doing. It's a really great mission that you have.